When I first saw this game, I was expecting something that would be bursting with character and have a lot of fun, silly moments and kind of weird, wacky, characters and dialogue. But when you actually play the game, it's very, very different. Momodora is a very, very dark game. It takes place in this world that's been riddled with a disease and a priestess who's seeking to save the world from it by visiting the queen of the city of Karst. There's pretty little dialogue in the game, and that which is there is usually kind of dark, and usually the characters take themselves pretty seriously. And one thing I was a little bit disappointed with is some of the characters you see, you hardly interact with them. These cool guys on the right side, these, really dark looking evil dudes are usually just bosses you see once, and you fight and they're one and done. But don't get me wrong, this is actually a very good and very well designed game. First of all, it's visually impressive. The first boss in the game you battle is this centipede weird demon monster, and when you defeat it, it turns to stone and stays there for the rest of the game. So when you come back there later when you have more health and have powered up, you're like, I remember this guy, It adds a lot of character to the game, keeping that boss there like that. And a lot of the artwork of the game is presented wonderfully. There's excellent use of contrast in the backgrounds. One of the things I really like is this red gate, approaching the castle of Karst, the final area of the game. It's so ominous with like the kind of white flowers on the ground as well. It's very well done. It's also a very interesting world, the way it's structured. There's this cool feeling of height as you climb, from the very bottom of the Cinder Chambers all the way up the ladder to the top of the Forlorn Monastery. It feels like you're really climbing the towers of this city and gives a sense of its expanse. And once you get to the main city, the game becomes very non-linear. There's 4 chunks of this little key item you need to get, and you can collect any of them in any order as long as you have the right power-ups to get it, which is pretty impressive game design. But all of these events, these characters, these things that happen in this world, they don't really pop, they don't feel real, or as if it doesn't feel that this world's really in danger of this sickness and disease. Now, there are a lot of reasons for this. Some of them are small, like I mentioned, some of these characters that you only see once, or a lot of the characters seem a bit stereotypical and very dark. One of the more significant things that I think affects this, causes this kind of flatness, is the soundtrack of the game. The soundtrack for this game is actually pretty decent. There's a lot of pretty good songs in here. For example, you have the Whiteleaf Memorial Gardens, which is this kind of halting and hesitant piece with a lot of empty space and kind of lighter instruments. This really conveys this serious but hopeful and gentle atmosphere that you'd kind of expect from a graveyard. And in contrast, you have the Subterranean Grave, which is this eerie, heavy, full song that's almost synthetic and kind of unnatural, and it's really fitting for this submerged, area that almost feels like the music is surrounding you like water. But a lot of the music in the game tends to be kind of uninteresting or unmemorable. It was weird. I would find myself walking back into an area and the song would come in and I'm like, I don't remember that. Or if I leave the area, I'd have trouble kind of remembering the song that was in there. And I was kind of trying to figure out why that is. So I sat down and took a listen to the music again, and I kind of did a little bit of analysis, and I'd like to share my results then. Let me show you a specific example. So here is the soundtrack that plays in the Forlorn Monastery, which is titled Alabaster. This piece is simple and focused, and it conveys well the seriousness of the monastery and its sometimes overly eloquent priestesses. Now take a listen to this one section here. Just from listening to it, you can kind of tell it's a little bit repetitive in this section. Here's the sheet music for it as well. You can see in the left hand, or the bass, it's playing the same kind of set of 6/8 notes, this ascending kind of pattern in each measure. And in the right hand of the treble, it's consistently doing these kind of longer chords that are held. Looking at the chord progression in the Roman numerals, we can see there isn't too much variation either. It starts off in the tonic, the bass, of course, and then changes to the seventh, just kind of going down a full step back to the first. Then we go 2 measures back to the seventh, back to the first. We get a little bit of variation here. We kind of jump to the sixth and the fifth and back to the first, but then it kind of goes back to its typical the pattern that I was doing before. The thing I feel is the biggest detriment to this piece, at least in this section, is the lack of variation in pacing. Now, pacing in music is related to the rhythm. It's the distance between 2 notes in a single voice. So we take the right hand, for example. The treble voice is almost always 3 notes held, 3 notes held, and then 3 notes held again, and then 1.5 and 1.5, and then back to 3 notes held, 3 notes held, etc. The left hand doesn't have any rests, doesn't have any break. It's just a continuous flow of 8 notes from the start to the end of this section. Now, I know I'm complaining about this song a lot, but this is actually very fitting for the area it's in. A monastery, something religious, something very serious. Simplicity is one of the hallmarks of many religious orders. However, to achieve this simplicity and plainness, it sacrifices so much style and becomes so much less memorable as a piece, I feel. I like to compare this piece to the song known as Resting Grounds from the game Hollow Knight. It's actually very similar thematically and has some similar progressions as well. Let's take a listen to that. But I would argue it's much more interesting and memorable. So the left hand, or the bass, is mostly the same, and it's also in piano is the main instrument. But the right hand, you can see here from the sheet music, is much more different. It has a lot more variation in pacing. It has this cool syncopated part. You can see here where there's 4 notes that are played in the right hand, but 6 in the left hand. The instrumentation is slightly different as well. You have the same 2 pianos and the treble and the bass, but they sound different than just, plain grand pianos. They've had like a filter and some compression applied to them. It makes them sound more interesting, almost like up close and just different. Lastly, of course, there's another instrument that comes in to accompany the pianos. It's this grating, harsh strings that adds a lot of character to the place and gives a kind of different timbre for us to listen to. And I hope you could see by playing the song Resting Grounds over the gameplay from Momodora, you can kind of see that the song actually is a decent fit for this place. It still maintains that serious nature of the forlorn monastery while still being a little more interesting and memorable. Another song that I think suffers from a similar kind of issue is the kind of generic boss battle theme titled Confrontation. The opening to the song is pretty interesting. There's these strings and organ that are playing this ascending harmony, which is kind of dissonant and really interesting. But then about 30 seconds into the song, we get to this piano solo portion here. Kind of like in Alabaster, we see that the bass in this section is very repetitious. It's the same kind of beat throughout the whole thing, and some of the progressions sound a bit off too, just a little bit weird. I think because of this, the left hand keeps the same structure throughout this entire section. This whole part sounds a bit empty, like it needs some more instrumentation or some more variety to it. I'd be battling a boss and this part would come in, and it doesn't really sound threatening or very dangerous like a boss battle should be. One little side project I tried to do is to redo part of this section, but adding more articulation and instrumentation. So let me see how it sounds. I don't know, I think it definitely departs from the composer's style a bit, and maybe it's not as good as a fit because the instruments I used aren't the same ones that are used in the game. But you have to admit, I think it is more fun to listen to and at least tap your foot to. Now, one or two kind of not so exciting songs in the game isn't a big deal, but why I think it's important in Momodora is that the type of game it is. So it's a Metroidvania. It has all these unique and interesting areas to explore that have their own identity, their own threats, and kind of themes to them. And when the musical tracks for these areas are a little bit samey or not that memorable, they kind of start to blend into each other. Again, visually they're very unique and distinct, but they don't have that musical element to further separate them and identify them. I think the most notable exception to this is the area known as the Cinder Chambers. This piece starts off with this haunting choir and has this synthetic bass that kind of sounds the same as the one used in the Subterranean Grave. It also makes use of pitch bending, which is really interesting and used nowhere else really noticeably in the soundtrack. And the main theme that comes in the middle of the song is really harmonically interesting. I think it's the same theme as the White Leaf Memorial Park, but in a more distorted kind of haunting form, which is really cool. This, coupled with the dangerous hidden traps and its location in the map kind of towards the bottom of the world, make this area really memorable. Whenever I think back to the game, this one kind of stands out to me the most. In conclusion, the soundtrack of Momodora Reverie Under the Moonlight does its job fairly well. It conveys well the dark and gloomy world that our character ventures through. But to achieve this gloominess, the soundtrack tends to be very plain and not very memorable. At least certain pieces. Perhaps the composer didn't want to make anything too attention-grabbing or exciting, instead keeping the player's focus on the action and the visuals, like the sprite work in the game. Either way, I'm curious to see if this musical style is also reflected in the other 3 Momodora games that are predecessors to this. Or perhaps in future installments of this series, they'll go with more exciting and attention-grabbing musical compositions.